Welcome everybody. Welcome to Google Developers Live. You're on the Chrome channel. I'm here today with Chris Wilson, developer advocate for Chrome, and Sean Bennett, a course architect at Udacity, and myself, Peter Lubbers, a program manager for Chrome. And we're here for the first office hours show for the CS256 Udacity course that we just launched last week. We had a great week. We're close to 50,000 people already have registered and signed up. And we're going to bring you every week for the next 5 weeks a series of office hours where you can ask your questions. And if you want to ask your questions, you can go to Google Developers Live, so that's developers.google.com/live, and find the weekly office hours shows, click on them, and then there's a moderator window that you can ask your questions or vote for questions. And so we're going to dive into that in just a second. We had a great week last week. We had the course launch on Monday. We had a GDL show with Sebastian Thrun, so definitely check that out. It's also on the GDL calendar. And just wanted to go over the first 3 lessons in this office hours show. In future sessions, we'll do, for example, next week, the same time, we will do lessons 4 and 5, then 6 and 7, 8 and 9, and then 10 through 12. So we break it up in that way, and hopefully you can go through a couple of those lessons and then ask your questions here, and we're here for 5 weeks to follow along. So without further ado, this first 2 lessons were pretty quick. I think the first one was sort of the syllabus. The second one was the mobile developer tools, a quick intro on how you can debug on mobile, which is pretty important. And there's a lot of great stuff in there now that even a couple of months ago wasn't there. We actually held off on that lesson to have things land in Chrome for that purpose.
Things weren't quite finished yet.
Right. Yes. Now, the third lesson is really where we get into the meat of the project, the viewport and UX. And so a couple of things about that lesson. First one is one of my favorite scenes in there. If you haven't seen it, the door slam is what we call it. We spent quite a bit of time in the Udacity studio slamming doors. In fact, a lot of people started walking by and saying, "What's going on here?"
I was just standing there slamming the door, and so I was like, "Are you okay?
Right.
What are you doing?"
You had the perfect double door for that. Though. That was great.
Yeah, that was a perfect. So the door slam, of course, meaning you go on a site and it blocks you from going any further on the web experience and tries to have you go on the mobile-only native experience. And in many cases, that's not really necessary. So in large part, that's what this course is about. But the viewport lesson, the third lesson, is also one of the ones that has been probably re-recorded the most.
I think I did spend the most time re-recording sections of that one. There was at least 4.
Yeah. So why was that? Why did you have to go back in so many times?
Well, I mean, this kind of comes out in the lesson, but viewport has kind of a long and storied history. I mean, it started when Apple introduced the first iPhone, and they had to figure out how to get the real web experience kind of shoehorned onto this browser.
Right.
On a very small screen. But then they also wanted to recognize that there were going to be people who were going to start writing for this device, like they were going to make it work well on the device. So they needed some controls on that kind of shoehorn as well. And the challenge was it was uncharted territory at that point. And what they came up with was kind of good, but it had some wacky little bits to it, I think. And it continues to have some wacky bits even today. And I mentioned in the lesson there's a couple of gotchas about developing for iPhone specifically, and there's not a lot of good guidance out there about why exactly you need to do this or that, like why you need that initial scale 1.0, or when you might want to use user scalable no. And I had to dig all of this up and figure it out, and I thought I'd figured it out, and then I would discover that no, that wasn't actually how it worked. And I think the last one that I had to re-record for was when I discovered that on the iPhone, when you rotate between landscape and portrait, it keeps the same, or it scales up the font size. It doesn't actually change the viewport in that case. It just scales up the font size, which if you have, if you haven't explicitly gone in and reset all of your CSS and set your font size in a fixed size, it will look like it's reformatting it.
Yeah, okay, right.
And I thought that it was for a while until finally I was playing with different content on the page and realized that in fact, no, it's not reformatting it. And it's different between the iPhone and the iPad in that case too. It's not just an iOS switch. It actually, I don't know if
wasn't
it's
it also different
size or something
between different versions of iOS? Or?
Yeah, it was like
absolutely.
6
They
and
have
7, right?
they have changed it between 6 and 7,
Which
and
is
that was
during the course.
I kept one of my devices on iOS 6 for a long time, specifically just to test that.
Yeah, yeah.
And then had borrowed someone else's iPhone to see what iOS 7 did. So
Yeah, I remember during the course development we had a lot of these
yeah.
does anyone have a phone with this and this
Yeah.
configuration?
Yes.
Sometimes not easy.
We were borrowing a lot of random phones from around the
right,
office.
yes,
yeah.
I've finally
And you
gotten
had
to,
like 5 or 6.
yes, I've finally
lying
gotten to
around.
stop carrying around the pile of mobile devices in my backpack everywhere I go.
Yeah.
I only I carry a few, but not 5 different phones.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the other ones we had was the mobile dev tools. When you turn on the developer mode on the Android,
Right. Yeah.
it's really weird.
It's a
You have to go
one-time.
into the steps, and then you have to press the build number 7 times. Doing that is only a one-time thing. I think you have to
Right.
Yeah.
reset your whole phone.
Yeah, you have to
undo it.
factory reset
Right,
yeah.
and
So-
wipe everything on it to get rid of that.
We only had one shot at that video.
Yeah. If it didn't work, it didn't work.
Right.
We actually, I think we had to use my phone because you'd already done that on
that's
your
right.
phone,
It wasn't
and
your
then realized that we couldn't do it again.
Yeah, tried to tap it 7 times again and it didn't work.
That was actually, and that's part of one of the more frustrating things I think is that process is a little bit different on every single device, and
Yes.
that's something that I think our students have come across too.
Yeah, there
that
have
we
been
need
comments in the forum about that it's
Yeah.
different on different devices, and different versions of Android did something subtly different there.
And finding all of that is a little bit problematic. I think probably something we should do is kind of have some of that commentary in the instructor notes down the bottom that we should compile.
Definitely.
The students have actually done a great job of starting that off already.
Nice. Great. So we've got a couple of questions, I think around 10 or so that we have on the dory. So again, if you have questions for the next office hour session, go to developers.google.com/live and then find there's a calendar there. You can find the office hour sessions. If you click through to the page, then you can find a moderator window at the bottom where you can ask your questions, you can vote for questions, so that's a great way to get in. So again, next week, same time, we'll be covering 4 and 5, and then the following 3 weeks after that, we'll do more office hours. So first question is from Epocolis from Toronto. I want to develop a mobile web app, and what tools, IDEs, languages, frameworks like Ember, Dart, Backbone, and so on, would you recommend? And I think maybe it would help to start with why we didn't cover those specifically in the course.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to really like to understand the techniques that I'm using at a very low level. So understand why, not just, hey, put this viewport boilerplate at the top of all your pages because it's magic and it just makes everything better, but understand exactly what it does and how it works and what it's going to do, which is why we didn't really focus on using a lot of frameworks particularly, because many of the frameworks, they just bake all of that in. They've already done a lot of the responsive design for you even. And as long as you stick with exactly their sets of elements in your pages, it'll all reflow, but you may forget and you may not realize that you've just locked it to a particular size when you do that. So we didn't really want to focus on a particular framework because of that. And in terms of IDEs, most of this really, again, we were getting down to the basics of what the actual HTML and CSS and JavaScript is in the page, so we didn't want to lock into a particular IDE. You will notice, of course, we used Sublime, but really didn't do much other than syntax highlighting.
Yeah. I mean,
in Sublime.
any IDE should work just fine.
Any IDE should work. There's a lot of cloud IDEs out now as well, so which I think is kind of cool because you can take things with you a little more easily. As far as languages go, obviously HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on the client are great. We're starting to see a fairly large uptake in Dart usage as well in large-scale mobile applications. Obviously, I wouldn't start out by trying to learn that just in order to build any mobile web app. And then on the server side, of course, I think the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different things to do there.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is like you don't want to just package all those things in there for maybe. And you have to really think about what are you using these libraries for? Do you really need it? Because on mobile, you're going to have additional downloads for those libraries. It's going to just take more time.
I mean, each single additional request that you make is going to potentially be a big deal, right?
I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges that I have is people will send me code all the time and say, hey, could you help me figure out what's going on here? And I have to dig through 3 different frameworks and figure out how they're interacting with each other, which isn't always what they're designed to do either.
Right.
And as Sean said, on mobile particularly, every single download adds to the weight of your application coming across that wire.
Yeah, I mean, you can mitigate some of that by using front-end library frameworks like Bower or something like that to kind of minimize and concatenate all of this stuff. But I mean, it still has to come down the wire at some point or another.
Right.
And a lot of people make the mistake of not doing things like that and just, for example, including it from another, from like the library's website or something. And that's just another network request that you have to worry about.
They might find that in the sample code or something.
Right. Yeah.
Actually, that sort of brings, I guess, the next question from Rockstar in Pune. What is mobile optimization technique? So it's probably a little bit of a vague question, but I think we just talked about some of these things, right? We have a performance lesson later in the course, and one of the main things that we really wanted to do in this course was to build in performance really from the start. So like there's mobile first and there's performance first.
Perf matters.
The perf matters. Hashtag.
Everything first. First all the things.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it was interesting because we wanted to really actually start out with the performance lesson.
We did, actually.
Our original idea was like, let's start with performance.
Yeah.
But then you can't, if you haven't done anything yet,
right? Like
it's
you can't
kind of hard
just
to
jump into that without any other information.
It's easy to be fast when you haven't done anything.
Right,
Empty page.
Show up.
Very fast. But yeah, so the performance lesson talks in more detail about the different kinds of things you might consider. One of those would be those frameworks or the different libraries, like trying to really figure out what you need, minimizing things. I would say Rockstar, follow along, and maybe if you have some more very specific questions, post them in the when we get to that lesson, and then we'll cover those in more detail.
One more thing that we said in that lesson, I believe, was if you are using those frameworks, any of those frameworks, be sure to check and see if there are faster optimized versions of those that are specific to mobile, or at least are heavily mobile optimized. Some of the frameworks, particularly the older ones, aren't really optimized for mobile yet, but there are alternatives to them, like Zepto for jQuery and things like that.
Yeah, or if they're just light versions of those, like jQuery Lite or something like that. That it's probably not mobile optimized, but it's still quite a bit smaller and faster. So
good point.
Another thing that you might want to do is just follow along with, we mentioned hashtag perf matters, but you might want to look at that on your social network of choice, because there's a lot of great stuff there.
Yeah, and there's also, that's a great point. There's also HTML5 Rocks now has a whole mobile section, and there's a lot of great articles coming out, especially last quarter. A ton of great new content, so definitely check that out. It's a great way of learning more about that.
Yeah.
So Aniket Gole from Mumbai, how do I start a mobile web development project? I have the idea in mind, like starting from app design or database design. So I would probably not start with the database design. I would start probably more at the what the user experience might be, and your idea for the app. And you have any?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, if you start from the how you're storing the data, that really that locks you in. It's hard to change that after the fact. Really hard to change that.
You do have to be very careful about fully designing your database and then trying to go back later and changing it. Although I will say I think it depends on the app rather heavily too. I mean, if what you're really trying to do is a contacts list or something, it kind of makes sense to start from at least an initial database design.
Yeah.
Don't go, populating all the massive data in your back end or anything until you've done a little bit of the front end too. But if you have a true MVC model in your application, that makes it easier to do those things separately too, to have those components separate.
Yeah.
Perfect. Question from Macy from LA. I want more practice. Can you give out more projects on top of the exercise? And what should the mobile web dev learning path be when there's so many languages to learn? HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, Python, which can't be all learned at once. And that's true.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, that's very true.
Well, the good news on learning more stuff is there is a whole web and CS path at Udacity. There's also
that we are still trying to build out and slowly.
as maybe
it's a work in progress.
If you tuned in last week, Sebastian has big plans for 60 courses.
How are you doing on those 60 courses?
Have you?
There's been some sleep,
Okay.
Okay.
It's been good. 20 minutes here or there.
Cut that out. It'll be
right. It is kind of overwhelming. Like if you want to learn all this stuff, it's exciting. I guess the best thing would be start taking the paths that exist there, and it's not just on Udacity, but you can. There's many other things. For example, the JavaScript, the Discover Dev Tools Code School course that we linked to.
Yeah, that is
it's really good. It's quick. You can learn just a lot of stuff, and in the process, you learn to use the dev tools, but also you learn more about how web pages are put together. So more projects. I think one of the things I would suggest is try to build your own app, right? Like try to come up with a concept that you're excited about, something that you want to do or have been trying to do for a while, and try it out. And that's probably like learn by doing.
There's a bit of a tough balance here between people who already have an idea like that they want to build, and trying to create projects that just anyone can build, because you want someone to be building projects they care about. They're going to learn more. They're going to learn better if they're doing that.
Yeah, when we started developing this course, there was a lot. We went back and forth on what exactly we would center the course around repeatedly. We had this whole chart of we could do this app or this app or this app. And we finally ended up with a conference app because it was one that not only did we think it hit most of the lessons, like we could sort of address most of the lessons in it, but it was something we cared about and something that we actually did want to see, this kind of application. We'd had a need for it before. Hopefully we'll have a need for it in the future too, and we can keep working on it. I do think the biggest thing I would say about trying not to learn everything at once is you don't need to do all facets of an application at the same time. You can fake up the back end, fake up the data store for a while, and don't dive into PHP and Python at the same time that you're trying to figure out your advanced CSS and do the front end. I know certainly when I look at where I am on the learning curve, I'm in a very different place in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript than I am in PHP and Python. I'm much more of a front-end person than a back-end person. If I was trying to do a heavy-duty back-end database, I'd find somebody else to work with on it.
That's actually a really good point. So finding a buddy or someone to work with is really great. And one good way to find that is by going on Meetup. There's actually quite a few meetups. For example, I run the San Francisco HTML5 meetup, and we've done study groups like that in the past.
Or code jams, which is great too.
But there are actually meetups happening right now. For example, in the Bay Area, there's a meetup that is following this course. Every Sunday, they're getting together in person, and then you can learn a lot, because some people come from a database background or another background, then you can just kind of help each other. So.
And this helps also in figuring out projects to do, because you might not have an idea, but it's a lot easier to be creative and have an idea like that when you can just bounce things off of each other. It's hard to just come up with your own thing completely in a vacuum.
And if there isn't one in your area, start one. Like I know there's lots of people out there who want to learn the same things that you do.
Right. That's great. So a question about some technical difficulties. There's a problem with problem set 3, not getting credit despite completing the task. So something you can.
Yeah. So
alert
I responded to this a little bit earlier in the week, saying that if there continue to be problems with these, then we'd probably replace these with some videos and such, because most of these problem sets are fairly open-ended. Going back to the build something yourself, we really want people to think about how these lessons impact their own projects, either stuff they've already built or stuff that they want to build, and discuss that with other people. Discussing these things and these ideas on the forums or on a meetup or wherever is a very important part of this. So yeah, we might just replace this with something kind of open-ended that I think fits the spirit of the course a bit more anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was from Sam in Brussels, so Belgium. So all right, so we'll look into that. How many of these apps from Yankee in India, how many of these apps can work offline? Does making mobile apps include making of games? And I need to know what types of apps we're going to make in this course. So, well, there are a couple of questions in there. But the app that fits with this course is the conference app that we reference quite a bit. To make an app that literally covers every detail of every lesson would be a little bit of a contrived example. But we tried, as Chris mentioned earlier, to get something
try. But there were certainly some parts where we looked at it and just said, this is kind of weird. Putting the
not making sense.
Putting the device motion API into the conference app was a little strange.
I mean, we used local storage, I believe, in the conference app, but I don't think we do much. We have an app cache, but it's not.
I mean, actually, the biggest thing that we don't do right now in this course with that app is we don't actually do the data model the way you would need to. You would need to have a local storage database or index database, most likely, of course, that is synchronizing the data with an external server and figuring out a good policy for when and how to update that and upgrade the database, which has a lot of back-end component to it, which is why we didn't actually do it in the course. Right now, we're pulling in all that data through JSON and just loading it up. And we did do an app cache. It's the offline lesson actually walks you through how to do an app cache for just the conference application and the data that it currently uses. So the app that we're doing does do offline, does work offline. I think when I think of what you can do on mobile, what you should do on mobile with the web platform, I'd say you should always try to make your apps work offline, because it's not always offline. I walk around my office and we don't get great cell reception on my carrier in the middle of my office. It's actually okay because I'm on Wi-Fi most of the time, but there's still that latency of Wi-Fi that you can radically improve, even with app cache and its much maligned capabilities and syntax. It still is a powerful tool for getting your apps to work offline. On the games question, we don't actually really dive into games in this course at all. Some of the APIs, device motion and things like that, you will think about it and say, wow, this could be really cool in an app. Some of our examples even, I think, were little mini games. But there is I'll play Colt for a second here. I should shave my head or something. There's a great course. You should check it out. CS255 on Udacity that Colt did on making HTML games. And a lot of that applies as well on mobile.
And I think a lot too, like the performance lesson especially, definitely applies to games as well. More than anything, you need to get that performance characteristic down if you really want to make a game.
Yes, if you're interested in making games on mobile using the web platform, I think I would look very carefully at performance. Anything you can learn about performance is going to help you. The unfortunately still in progress responsive images solution is going to be pretty critical because on mobile devices, you really do want it to be kind of native device resolution because it'll look beautiful. And at the same time, you have to be careful not to dump tons and tons of data. So offline's also very important. So I think those three lessons are going to end up being incredibly critical.
Yeah, I actually was messing around with a WebGL game just this past weekend, I think,
Right.
and I was really excited to see. It obviously loaded just so much data because it was a full 3D game in the browser, and it asked if it could store data offline and everything for me. And a little pop-up came up and said, please click yes on that, because then the next time that you load this, it'll actually go much faster.
Right.
And then I went ahead and reloaded it, and it was about a few seconds to load all the data at that point. I was like, this is awesome.
That works. Nice. All right, so we have a linguistics student from Tennessee. If I don't have any Android equipment at all, and just a Windows computer with Chrome, can I find a way to start the lesson? So yes, a lot of the information you can go through just in the browser.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, all of it. You can do the entire course without any mobile device. The only problem is there are parts of the course that you won't be able to actually in practice see. Like Viewport is a good example where Viewport does something very dramatic on mobile. It's very critical for you to use viewports on mobile, and at the same time they take no effect whatsoever on the desktop browser.
Right.
So it's not going to change anything in the desktop.
Yeah. So you can basically take it all,
but following along and seeing these things
right.
for yourself is going to be much harder.
And once you get to the point of really trying to develop mobile web applications, the performance lessons even, I mean, you're going to need to do this on a mobile device.
Yeah.
You can still get going without a mobile device.
And you can simulate some of the issues that you'll run into with things like
Certainly.
browser stack, but I mean, there's really no substitute for having a device there to actually experiment with.
And actually, if you go into the developer tools, in the emulation tools, you can actually turn on some of those features too.
Mobile overrides.
Do the overrides.
Yeah, that's true. It's not as good as actually pairing the phone up, but it does still give you some of the same type of issues, especially the layout type of issues.
Any of them.
So we have another question from Adriano in Egypt. I love how we have students from literally all over the world asking questions, which is just great. And if you're watching, then thanks for staying up late.
I think we've
so the question is PhoneGap useful for mobile web developers?
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah.
I think quite useful for packaging up applications so that you can sell them in the different stores, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
For example, for Chrome apps, that's sort of currently the actual solution for getting those apps in other web stores, right? Chrome apps you can build in HTML5 and then distribute through the Chrome web store. But if you want to hit the other stores, and a lot of this is all about monetization, then it's a great great product.
PhoneGap, and I think the open source version is Cordova.
Well, so the name has changed. I mean, it's sort of interchangeable.
It's kind of
Apache Cordova.
I mean, keep in mind that isn't going to replace the lessons you need to learn from this course. It's a packaging mechanism to get it into more areas, to get it into a bunch of app stores. You still have to build the application.
It's also useful if you want to access device APIs that haven't yet landed in the HTML5 spec yet.
Correct. Right.
So if you wanted to do, for example, push notifications, it's a great way to do that while still writing essentially a web app.
Yeah, exactly.
And just adding functionality until we get that in the web, which hopefully we will pretty soon.
Being worked on. But it takes a little while, right? Cool. There's a question from Nab in Nepal. I tried to test my mobile web app on both ways, on emulator ARM as well as on Chrome Canary, but I feel it is very difficult to work with them due to speed. Is there any other way to test my site quickly?
I'm not familiar with what emulator ARM is.
No.
Oh, running the Android emulator.
Oh, is that what
So the Android emulator is painfully slow to run the browser on. It was at least the last time I did it, which was, I'll grant you, a while ago.
But also on Chrome Canary. So there are some issues with Canary, maybe, or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's still pretty...
it's Canary.
Yeah, it's Canary. So it's
use at your own risk.
Right. Yeah. You can also try doing this on Chrome Stable. or not Chrome Stable, Chrome Beta.
Yeah.
And I think all the emulation features are there in beta, right?
I mean, there are some great features in Canary.
Right.
That if you want the latest and greatest and cutting edge, but sometimes things break.
It's going to be a little buggy. It gets rebuilt every day, so.
Right. So,
but in terms of speed, I don't think there are at least I haven't noticed any issues. I'd love to.
Especially if you're running it locally, there shouldn't really be any issue. I mean, just as a way to try things out, I think if you run your site on localhost in Canary, I think really there shouldn't be a problem. If maybe there's a connectivity problem there,
that could be
not great bandwidth or something like that. So hopefully try that out, running things locally in Canary. I think it should be okay now.
Yeah, I mean, and if you have more specific questions, I'd love for you to post it again, like in later lessons, especially the performance lesson. Exactly. If it's an issue with performance, like more generally as well.
Right.
But
yeah. So there's a question from Donnie. Will the course include an introduction to the Google Closure compiler for optimizing performance? The short answer is no.
No.
The course is already it's already finished, so it doesn't have that. There's probably some information on that out there.
I mean, using the Google Closure compiler, I think there's some fairly reasonable docs on that. We didn't really get into, any kind of optimization or minification libraries or anything like that. But again, there are plenty of good resources.
Closure is a great tool.
We actually use it all the time.
There are so many great tools out there.
I think that's part of the reason why we didn't talk about a lot of those too, is because there are a lot of different great tools, and if we talked about one, we'd just get a bunch of people saying, well, why didn't you talk about, X library, that's my favorite. And once you learn a few of them, then they're all fairly similar.
We could probably start a few religious wars.
Yes. I think the latest one is grunt first gulp.
Oh, I'm going to move over away from Sean.
Nice.
Lightning bolts hit him.
Yeah. Okay.
So Oscar in Mexico, he's asking, are we going to be using Eclipse in the Android SDK to develop apps, or mainly HTML5, CSS, JavaScript? So, quick answer there, Oscar. No, it's really just HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript for this course. Really, that's all you need for building great web experiences. It's simple. Next question from the Netherlands, my home country. Should have moved this up a little bit, of course. If you use other than HTML, such as Python, and you test on localhost and use port forwarding to the tablet, how do you use Google Chrome tools? Because you cannot save the changes.
Why? You should be able to save changes.
There is a way.
Not if you're back. If you're using port forwarding.
Oh, right. Okay.
Right, you can do it. You can do it locally on the desktop
browser,
but you can't port those changes back.
I see.
Right.
Yeah. Stay tuned, I think, is the only answer there. I don't know how soon that's going to get resolved. Personally, what I would likely do is I would keep the mobile debugging session open and open a desktop debugging session on the same set and make the changes at the same time.
Right.
It's not a great solution. You're still making the changes twice.
So this is a good point. I'll float it past some of the DevTools folks and see if it's on their radar.
They may actually have a solution in progress.
Right.
They very well might.
DevTools was another area where while we were developing the course every day, it felt like something changed, and mostly for the better.
Yeah, it's like, well, this doesn't work. Oh, well, that change is coming. It's, look at it tomorrow.
I forget, there was one of them, I can't remember what it was, but I hit some bug, and literally what I had to do was close the browser and restart it, because the change, it had not only gotten detected and fixed by the DevTools team, it had already rolled out in Canary, and I just hadn't relaunched my browser yet.
Yeah, it's very fast moving. So we'll look into that a little bit, see if there's a better answer. I'll follow up in the moderator thread. So Jasudas from Nadar. To test all the websites, I normally use Firefox and Chrome responsive view for testing in tablets and mobile. But some people use Ripple. and there are little difference in rendering. Is there any difference between ripple and responsive views, like in the browser?
Ripple?
Are you familiar with it?
I'm not.
I'm not familiar with it.
So, okay. We're not familiar with that. So, let us figure that out, and we'll post an answer in the forum. And Sam Skis from San Francisco, where can I get information for the Sunday study group that I just mentioned? It's great to see all these live questions popping up here. So I will post a link to that. It's a new meetup. It's in, I think it's not in San Francisco. It's in, I think, the South Bay. I'll post a link, Sam, to that exact group, and I think it's great. I was actually asked to come over there on Sunday. I can't make it that particular time, but they're going to be hosting several of those, and it'd be great. So I'll post a link in the thread. It's on Meetup. Maybe you can do a search for it, but I'll post a link to it. So Neo Max Geek. Is that the real name?
Okay.
from Cairo. What is the best way to validate my game data, such as a score or player profile, if I'm dealing with the backend? All right, that gets a little bit off track from the first 3 lessons. I think maybe the best thing there is to check out some of the. Well, I guess the CS255 doesn't even cover that.
Really deal with that all that well. I guess it depends on what he means by validate. Does he mean like make sure that the player hasn't switched the data and then changed things around? Yeah. I think Colt has talked about this a few different times, and I think probably just for a quick answer. You want to make sure that the server is keeping track of everything that's going on, like each step of what's going on in whatever the game is, so that if the player tries to send erroneous data, then the server can say, well, that doesn't make sense based on everything else I know. Right. So you have the server continuously updating the game state as well as the player, so that the server can serve as a shake your finger at them kind of thing.
All right, so there's a question from Atlanta, from Amelia. I'm new to web development. I'm struggling to understand JavaScript. Along with this course, what tools or methods would you recommend for learning and understanding JavaScript? So,
I would say there are a number of good resources out there. There's some good resources at Codecademy and Code School right now. Just looking through some of the smaller snippet type websites like CodePen. It's often they're normally fairly descriptive in what they do. I'd also suggest looking through that.
There's some great books as well.
Yeah, and there's some great books.
Eloquent JavaScript. People that still read books.
Yeah. That's a fantastic.
What are those?
Yeah. Eloquent JavaScript is really really good.
Book.
Yeah. If you want to learn some of the ways that JavaScript can bite you, I'd also recommend JavaScript: The Good Parts. It's a fantastic book, and it really quickly gets you past a lot of the hiccups and headaches that that can happen. So I'd recommend that as well.
The hairiness of JavaScript.
Right. Yeah. That's as far as I'm concerned, is a must read.
Yeah.
I think both that and Eloquent JavaScript.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. A question from Tibu Van in Hyderabad. Using a separate HTML and CSS, will this be enough to build an awesome responsive web app, or is it good to go with media queries?
You didn't say awesome.
I just added that in.
Yeah. Now you're editorializing.
Now you're making stuff up.
Yeah,
Peter.
Seriously.
Wouldn't you want to build an awesome app?
He didn't say he wanted to build an awesome app.
Yeah. Mediocre app.
Sorry. I think Viewport is kind of the foundation. That's where you have to start.
Right.
It's by design that the very next lesson leads into media queries, though, because you can build an adaptive application. You can build an adaptive layout where you can stretch things. Right.
Yeah.
And you can, it kind of starts with, make it so that the browser understands exactly how big your screen really is, and that's Viewport. And then there's the tools for doing adaptive layout, where if the window is bigger or smaller, if the viewport is bigger or smaller, how do we draw into that? How do we stretch across that rather than having fixed sizes for everything? And then the final step is, there actually is a fairly sizable difference between developing for, my cell phone that's buried in my pocket somewhere, and my 2 different sizes of tablets and my desktop and laptop screens. And for that, you really do need to use media queries. I mean, you need to have that adaptiveness of, well, if I have this much room to render into, I would do something very different than if I have this much.
Basically, whenever you have to go to a fundamentally different layout scheme, it's really, you need to use media queries.
Yeah.
Cool. So a question from Rinav. Could we have a brief session on AdMob, monetizing app and publishing it on the Play Store? So Rinav, not really part of this course. One of the things I would suggest is go on Google Developers Live, what you're on right now, developers.google.com/live. And there's a big calendar there that has GDL, or Google Developer Live sessions, from all kinds of products. You find stuff about Android, you find stuff about AdMob, for example. I can also check with some of the people internally to see what they would recommend, maybe an intro to that. So I'll post that in the moderator. So, and then we've got our final question from Kalama Ivan from Uganda. I'm new to mobile app development and Android, but I've totally failed to run my first app in the emulator, even after doing everything right as instructed. And can we have some insistence? So you don't really need to run things in the emulator.
Not for this course, at least.
Yeah. Running them in the Android emulator is pretty challenging right now, because it's going through so many steps of emulation there that it's kind of, I mean, it's running Chrome on top of the emulator, and that makes it kind of challenging.
And very slow.
I wasn't going to put it that way, but since you brought it up, yes.
Yes.
It's pretty slow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, there's another question that just popped up. What is the best way to test mobile web on different devices that has on the market? Let's see. Having all the devices very hard. Oh, I see. So question is like, how do you keep up with the plethora of devices?
Right. Yeah.
From NAB in Nepal.
So having a bunch of different devices is hard, especially like if you don't have just the money to do that, or can't get the devices.
Even just keeping them all up to date,
is
keeping
kind of a
them
pain.
Running. Yeah. If you need to run on iOS 6 and iOS 7, you need 2 different devices, and all these other.
Yeah. Maintaining a device lab is surprisingly really difficult.
Hard.
Yeah.
As
really
well
is.
as expensive.
Yeah. As well.
But there are
expensive.
some open, like free device labs in different countries. I'm not sure anything close to NAB in Nepal, but I know, for example, in Germany and England, there's these device labs where people can go in and do that. So maybe something like that.
Yeah. And I mean, if you can't get to an actual device lab, then again, browser stack and similar services are. I mean, it's not quite the same thing.
It's not quite the same thing, but it is a big help. I think the best advice I could give is, make sure you do, as you're becoming a real professional level web developer on mobile, you need to have at least a few different devices, and different is a critical piece there. Don't just get 2 phones that are almost identical. Get a phone and a tablet, and get an iOS device and an Android device, and branch out as much as possible.
I think PPK, he mentioned once, like every couple of months you just need to invest in a new phone or something like that.
He's a little bit more hardcore.
I know.
On that than,
it's a bit extreme.
than I would expect everyone needs to be.
No.
There are also some things that you can test against then much more easily. Like if they're the same version of the browser that are running on these different devices, you can actually go in the desktop browser and change the change what override you're using, and tell it, okay, now act like you're a whatever device, and that will usually cover the differences between like a Nexus 7 tablet and a Nexus 4 phone.
Overrides in the dev tools. There's also the Opera mobile emulator. Things like that are a good way to substitute. Actually, we're getting more questions in as we speak. That was the last question, but now we have 4 more. So, how can we use this course to help build a portfolio which will show a range of new topics covered? Can we have more examples to build on? So we're unlikely to add new sample apps, but those apps, you can actually just grab them, modify them any way you want. You can kick off a few of your own projects. Any other suggestions?
I think a lot of this is figuring out something you want to build that exemplifies, that lesson. For example, exemplifies touch. Maybe a drawing board app or something like that. Something relatively simple, but still showcases. Okay, I know how to use the touch or the pointer APIs to do this. Right. Building something small that you come up with is a really good way to go there.
I mean, for myself, one of the things that I did was I actually took, people who know me know I'm really passionate about audio things. Right. I took a bunch of my audio demos and I used them as examples. And one of them actually I used in the course as an example. But I went through and this actually taught me a lot about using Viewport, using Flexbox to do layout, and making it work across different devices and portrait and landscape. Like, I have my little audio recorder app. Right. That I put in, the ability to flip from portrait to landscape and have it reformat the UI completely when you do that.
Yeah. And some of it, I remember, it didn't take very much time.
No, it didn't take that much, and because it was an application that I was already kind of jazzed about, something that I found exciting to work on, it was really easy for me to learn that way.
Yeah. Exactly. One thing I if you don't have any ideas, one thing I might suggest for like the first few lessons where we're really talking about design and layout and things like that, just go to one of your favorite websites or web apps or something and figure out, well, how did they do that?
Yeah.
Open up the dev tools and look through things. It's sometimes a little bit hard to do, but
Or go to one of your favorite websites that doesn't work well on mobile and figure out how you would make it work on mobile.
Yeah. I did that with a newsreader that that I used that doesn't work on mobile at all, and it just annoyed me.
Newsreader actually was one of the candidates for our app, I remember. Yeah. And also in the intro, we used Google News as an example of an app that does adapt, and that's one of the things you can look through and think about is, how would I take this UI that works maybe really well on a desktop or a laptop, and how would I make that work well on a tablet? How would I make it work well on a phone? And I think that you'll get a lot of ideas from that.
Yeah.
Cool. So that was from QJ in Palestine. Okay. So question from Ankur in India. Till now, I know that we can make Android apps with Java or in Python using Kiwi. Which language do you use and which mobile platforms do these apps support? So that's simple. It's basically all HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that we're using in this course to build these web apps. And then the final question from Ali in Chicago. In this course, will you plan to cover tools like Yeoman, Bower, and Grunt? Also, will you plan to use any test frameworks in the course? Your favorite topic, Sean.
So no, we don't specifically cover Yeoman, Bower, and Grunt. You can look at those on the repo for the conference app.
Interesting that the conference app actually does use Grunt.
But we don't really go into those because they're fairly tool specific, and we felt it would detract from a lot of the other lessons that we wanted to teach. And we actually, I think near the end, we talked about maybe doing like build tools and something like that at some point. And at that point, we had already done we started with like 6 lessons. It's like, oh, we should split these 2 up, or we should add this. And then, all of a sudden we're at 12 lessons and it's getting monstrous. We were like, no more. We're stopping here. That said, though, tools like Yeoman and Bower and Grunt are, really fantastic. They do a lot of this build stuff for you and automate some of that. It can be a little bit of a headache at points, especially if you're not quite familiar with those tools. Yes. But it does do a lot of really nice stuff for you.
Honestly, using app cache and offline with build tools can be kind of a pain too, unless you set it up to automate it and just keep touching your app cache and changing it, not just touching it, but changing the app cache file.
Right. So write a random string to it.
Yes.
Cool.
+1.
Wow, the questions just keep
Oh, okay.
rolling in. I thought we were done, but
Okay.
there's a couple
Oh.
more. So we have a couple more minutes. One from Dilvan, from my favorite city in the world, Lisbon, Portugal. The future of mobile development, is it HTML5? Well,
Oh, we're a bit biased.
We're-
I think.
might be slightly biased.
You're asking the wrong people here.
we think so. But
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
lots of opportunities for
Right.
lots
I
of
mean,
different choices.
I really believe in the web as a platform just because it's, it's one platform that everyone can run that's not, that you don't have to build different code base, completely different
Right.
code bases for everything. There are tricks and tweaks and, it's not all roses and unicorns.
Yes.
But, I mean, it's a lot closer than having to maintain two entirely separate code bases.
It is. I mean, I've been at this a long time, and my background was in the days when it was whether you had a Windows app or a Mac app.
Yeah.
And at the time, most major applications, particularly in like media areas that I was interested in, they didn't build all the time on
Yeah.
both platforms because it was very hard. They're totally different API sets. Different languages effectively because you were Objective-C on one and C++ on the other. And even where we are today with native mobile platforms, it's still usually a pretty significant change between those two. So you really are developing two separate applications. And then again, on the desktop space, I look at the things that I use today. Very little of what I use on the desktop is an app. It's a web app. You go look at my desktop machines at home, and even this machine, it's probably running Sublime and
A browser.
a couple of browsers at any given time, and that's all it's really running because so much of what I do is in the web platform. And I think that it's natural that move to mobile as well. There are definitely some rough areas there right now. There are definitely parts of the user experience that end to end are not as smooth, and I think those are getting worked on by all the vendors, by all the mobile vendors. And obviously, a native platform always can innovate a little faster as well, and that's kind of a challenge. But I think there's so much you can do with the web platform today on mobile, and that's where I really hope that people look at the device access lesson, for example. And really think about what you could do with this platform, because there is a ton of stuff in there, and you can build so many compelling applications. And having it, just in the palm of your hand is a very powerful thing.
Great. All right. One question from Benjamin in Atlanta was about NetBeans. I think one of the maybe confusing parts has been that you really don't need the typical Android stack for development here. It's really just web development and keeps it very simple. Your HTML editor, you need your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Use Chrome dev tools, any other dev tools as well. But there's some really nice features in developer tools in Chrome that can help you develop and debug that very quickly. So that's what I would recommend. And then
many of which are very new, by the way. That's why we say that. It's
Right,
not that we're saying other browsers don't have good developer tools, because they certainly do. It's just, the DevTools team on Chrome has been doing some awesome work lately, and it's just so compelling. It's so neat to be able to just plug it in and
I know, just
set breakpoints and watch your performance profiles on the actual mobile device. That's really cool.
Yeah.
I mean, my basic setup is, a terminal, Chrome DevTools, and probably brackets because it's got a pretty sweet interface.
And one of these.
And
one
a
of
USB
those,
cable.
One of these.
and a USB cable.
You need a USB cable.
that's all you need.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. So with that, there's one final question from Tibuvan in Hyderabad, and then we're going to close
Just
it
keep
up.
coming.
Yeah, I know. This is great,
great.
And just where they're coming from is just incredible. So, is there any server-side language to be used in mobile development other than Java and PHP? I heard about Node.js, and which is faster. So, Node.js is definitely
It's
a great
really
way
nice.
to develop on the server side because you're effectively writing in JavaScript.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's true. It's not that Node.js is faster running on the server. It's not that your code running in the browser is going to be faster if the back end is in Node.js. It's really that if you're already learning JavaScript, or if that's if you're sitting there and you've learned JavaScript to do the front end of your application on the client, and you need to start building the back end, and your choices are use Node.js, which is JavaScript, or go learn PHP or Python or Java or whatever from the ground up. Probably a little easier to get started with Node.js. I think Node.js is fantastic.
I'm
certainly am a big fan. It's not the only solution by any
not
stretch
at all.
either.
I mean, we use Python at Udacity, and it's we really like it. Node.js is also something fantastic. It really depends on what you want to learn and what fits you. I mean, backend languages are relatively interchangeable depending on what you want to do.
Well, hopefully that wire, there's the what you get over the wire, and you can change each part of that independently.
Right. Yeah.
Well, great. So that wraps it up. Want to thank everybody that asked questions. Some great questions in there, and they just kept on coming. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And this session will be recorded, so we'll make the recordings available. They will actually be available at the same exact URL. Next week, we'll be covering lessons 4 and 5 from the course. So again, you can go to developers.google.com/live and find next week's session and click on it. Go to the bottom of the page and start asking your questions. You can. It's not too late.
Vote on questions too.
Right. Yeah. The voting has been great because it keeps actually.
It bumps questions up, so we we
right. So
make sure we get the highest voted ones.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, with that, I'd like to wrap it up. Thanks, Sean, Chris,
thank you
for coming, and see you next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.